Welcome back. Let's set the agenda for our first case study. In this lesson, we will use AutoLayout to design a pattern resembling the flag of England. Here it is. Let's now visualize the individual components of this pattern. So we have one background red rectangle and 4 white rectangles. The white rectangles are of equal width and height. And yes, each white rectangle is pinned to one of the 4 corners of the red rectangle. And there is this equal gap running between the white rectangles that gives us the illusion of a red cross. We will use a concept called design by intent while creating our layout for this pattern. At this point, I'm just going to introduce the term design by intent. We will understand what it means further in the lesson. Also, please refer to the material attached with this lesson. Let's now head to Xcode and tackle our first case study. Okay, so I'm going to start by creating a new Xcode project. It'll be a single view application. And let's call it Flag of England. The language will be Swift and the device the iPhone. Let's create it. Now I'm going to go to the main storyboard section. And as you can see, our storyboard has one view controller. So let's highlight it. And after that, let's go to the file inspector. So as you can see, by default, our storyboard uses AutoLayout and size classes. So I'm going to disable size classes. So disabling size classes limits documents to storing data for a single device family. So please note that's important. So we'll keep size class data for the iPhone. So let's disable size classes. Now I'm going to hide the utility section as well as the navigation section. So let's focus on our storyboard. So as you can see, our storyboard has one view controller, and this view controller by default has 3 sections. So we have a main view onto which we will be dragging and dropping other entities. Then there's the stop layout guide that creates this margin. Now this is an important note. And there's also a bottom layout guide. So let's go to our view first. I'll open the utilities section and go to the attribute inspector and change the background color to red. Now onto this red super view, we are going to drag and drop 4 subviews. So let's go to the object library and search for a view and then drag and drop it onto our super view. I'm going to narrow it down a bit and also stretch it vertically. So as you can see, while I'm moving the subview, there are margins appearing on the screen. So that's the top margin. We have a left margin, a right margin, and also a bottom margin. Now these margins provide an element of padding, but we do not need this padding for this lesson. So let me just move our subview a bit to the left and also stretch it a bit. And now let's duplicate this subview. So here's one. I'll move it to the right and create another one, which I'll move to the bottom right, and another on the bottom left. So as you can see, our pattern has already emerged. So let's go to the document editor now, and as you will be noticing that these 4 subviews are elements or are components of the superview. Just make a note of that, please. So now, without doing anything else, I'm going to preview this output for the iPhone 6. So let's run the simulator. So this is how our output will look in the portrait mode. And this is how it will look in the landscape mode. So as you can immediately see, there's a lot to be desired. So let's go ahead and fix things. Now before continuing, let's state what we intend to do. We intend to have our design work across the iPhone family. The app should also look good both in portrait as well as landscape modes. Now because of these conditions, we have to have a generic design. What does that mean, you ask? Well, we cannot have specific dimensions for the subview rectangles, for example. That will just not work. But what will work is this. We can say that each of the 4 subviews needs to be pinned to one of the 4 corners of the superview. This statement holds good for all iPhone families as well as portrait and landscape mode. Now in order to pin our subviews, let's click on the pin button out here. So this pin screen out here is quite an important one. So for the moment we will focus on this top portion of the print screen. So what you're seeing out here in the center is our highlighted view. And these numbers on all the four sides represent the distance of the subview from its four neighbors. So let's focus on this 0 out here. So 0 represents the distance between the top portion of the subview and its top neighbor. Similarly, 42 represents the distance of the bottom portion of our subview from its bottom neighbor. So who are these neighbors, you may ask? So the top neighbor in this case is nothing but the SuperView. Similarly, the left neighbor for the subview is again the SuperView. The right neighbor of the subview is actually this right subview. And similarly, the bottom neighbor of the subview is the bottom subview. So firstly, identifying the neighbors is important. The second thing for you to know is the constraints, are they relative to the margin or not? So out here by default, these constraints are with respect to the margin. So what does that mean? So this here is an example of the margins we were talking about. So we are going to disable constraints to margins for this lesson. So let's go ahead and uncheck this box. So now I'm going to pin this subview to the top left corner. So let's go ahead and check this option and this option. So automatically we have got two constraints that are set. So don't forget to click this button, add two constraints. So as you can see in the document editor, a constraints item pops up and within it you can see all the constraints. So let's first select this constraint and view its details in the attribute inspector. So as you can see, this is a horizontal space constraint. And what this constraint is telling us is the leading edge of this view is equal to the leading edge of the SuperView plus a constant value. So in this case, the constant value is equal, which essentially means that the leading edges are in sync with each other. So now let's click the second constraint, and this constraint is a vertical space constraint, and what it tells us is that the top of this subview is equal to the top of the SuperView plus 0, which means that the top of each of these views are in sync. And what we also have out here is a whole bunch of errors. So that's indicated by this red arrow. So let's click on the red arrow. So the system is telling us that there are a bunch of missing constraints. In other words, we have not added enough of constraints for the system to be able to create our layout. So this is something that you'll keep getting when you deal with AutoLayout, and something that we gotta fix as we go ahead. So let's continue adding our constraints. For that, we'll go to the document editor, and this time we'll focus on the second subview and pin it to the top left. So for that, I'm going to disable the constraint to margins, select these two options and add the two constraints. Similarly, we go to the third view, do the same and pin it to the bottom right, add the two constraints, and lastly the fourth subview, disable constraints to margin, select these two entities and add the constraints. So at this point, we should be having 8 constraints, and you can see their detail by highlighting the constraint and going to the attribute inspector. Now let us see whether we have made any progress in terms of the number of errors. So let's click on this button out here. And interestingly, we have many more missing constraints. So that's something to bear in mind, that sometimes adding constraints does not necessarily reduce the number of errors. So anyway, let's move this thought to one side, this negative thought to one side, and let's focus on our constraints and let's run the simulator. So this is how our final view looks like in the portrait mode. So as you can see, our constraints forced the subviews to be pinned to the 4 corners, and that's exactly what's happened in the portrait view. And let's check the landscape view. And yes, in the landscape view too, our 4 subviews are pinned to each of the 4 corners. So as you can immediately see at this point, that the thing that is missing is that these 4 subviews are not of equal width and height. So let's rectify that. Okay, so let's go back to our simulator and shut it down. And let's close this constraint window also. And let's highlight all 4 views, and we're going to make these 4 views of equal width and height. So let's go back to the pin screen, and there's this option of equal width and height. So let's click equal width, and it creates 3 constraints. And now let's click equal height, and that's another 3. So we have in total 6 constraints. So how do we have 6 constraints? Let's highlight 1 constraint. So as you can see, this view's height is equal to this view's height. So among the 4 subviews, you have 3 combinations for equal width and height. That gives us a total of 6 constraints. So now let's go ahead and preview our final output. And in this case, we should have the 4 subviews pinned to the 4 corners of the screen of the super view, and they should also be of equal width and height. So let's check that out. So this is our portrait mode, and yes, what I said has come true. And for landscape mode, it has not. So interesting. So we got to fix. So the next thing it seems we need to fix is the distance between each of the 4 subviews. So let's do that now. Okay, so let's first stop the simulator and also maybe go to this main view section out here. Now let's see what we need to do. We need to create an equal gap between these 4 subviews. Now there are a couple of ways we could do that. We could basically go to the pin screen and tweak things, but I'm going to try something different out here. So let's first highlight this top left view out here. Then I'm going to hold down the control key and drag and drop to the right subview and release. So that gives me a horizontal spacing constraint. So that created, let's go back to this constraints section and see whether the constraint is inserted. Here it is. So let's go to the attribute inspector. So what we have out here is the first item, the leading section of the first item is equal to the trailing section of the second item plus 20. Now, where did the 20 come from, you ask? Well, that was what was present in the default storyboard. It just picked up that value, but we could change this value. So let me change it to something bigger. Let's make it 40 and click enter. So the moment I did that, you can see this information in orange out here. So now I guess it's time for me to talk about the various colors that appear on the storyboard. So you have a bit of red, you have a bit of blue, and of course you have a bit of orange. So blue is good. Red and orange, no. So having said that, let's continue. So now I'm going to create a vertical constraint. So let's go ahead and do that. So for that, again, I'm going to go to my top view, hold down the control key, drag and drop towards the bottom subview and enter vertical spacing. And here we are, another constraint created. This time it took a value of 42. So let's change that to 40. And again, we have another plus 2 in orange. So you might have figured out that this represents the difference between the actual frame position and the frame position that is presently on the canvas. Another thing to note is that these errors, there was a red arrow out here, it changed to orange, which means things are getting better, but we still have a few misplaced views. So there's an expected value and an actual value. So this is maybe due to the positioning of a constraint or a frame. So this can be fixed. In order to do that, I have highlighted my main view and we go to this Resolve AutoLayout Issues section. Now, as you can see, this screen is split into 2 sections. One is selected views and a bunch of items and all views. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to update frames for the entire view, which is the super view and its subviews. Okay, so let's click on update frames. So as you see, the moment I did that, the frames get updated, but so this error arrow also disappears. So that is a good sign. So that done, let us go and trigger the simulator. Okay, so we start with landscape mode and things are looking pretty good this time. And here's the portrait mode. So as you can see, our 4 subviews pinned to the 4 corners, our 4 subviews each of equal width and height, and also the 4 subviews separated by an equal distance from each other. Now what you might find interesting is that I only created constraints between the top left subview and its adjoining subviews and not for the other ones. So I want you to think why we did not need to create these constraints for the other 3 subviews. So give that a thought and post a comment, please.